Who are the biggest debtors in the world? Governments. And the biggest, most highly indebted government is the United States government. We have $32 trillion of funded debt almost, and our unfunded liabilities, commitments that have been made where they didn't borrow the money, but they're on the hook, like guaranteed student loans or guaranteed pensions, Social Security, Medicare, all that stuff. That's like 100 trillion. So when the government creates inflation, they repudiate enormous amounts of their debt. And so the governments have massive incentives to create inflation, but then they have massive incentives to lie about it and pretend it's not as bad as it is and blame other people, which is the main reason that they redefined inflation from the expansion of the money supply to rising prices. Because when you know inflation is an expansion of the money supply, then you know who causes it. It's the government. You can't blame greedy corporations for it. You can't blame Putin for it. Putin doesn't print our money. We do. The Federal Reserve does. And so when politicians can redefine inflation, they can blame everybody but themselves. I mean, the United States is running $2 trillion a year plus deficits now. And technically, we're not even in a recession. The deficits are going to get even bigger when this next recession starts. But how are we financing those deficits? It's inflation. There's just no other way. Look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. So we know that inflation is going to be a significant threat. It's going to reduce the value of money. And so that has to be the single most important factor in driving your decisions on savings, on investing. And even for, in this day and age, if you don't have a lot of money to invest, I've been saying this for years to people. I started talking about it several years ago. People have to stock up on things. Buy things that you're going to use in a year or two. Buy it now, because it's going to be a lot more expensive if you wait. Why hold on to the cash if the cash is going to lose value? Just buy the things that you're actually going to need, because those things will retain their value if you're planning on using them. I think the current generation is going to pay for a lot of this stuff because the dollar is going to collapse. We could have hyperinflation, and because the future generations are not going to pay this. They're going to leave. They'll leave the countries because they're not going to want to be subjected to the confiscatory tax rates when they can't get commensurate benefits from government. They're going to leave. The currency is going to collapse in value, and we're already there. I mean, we're already at that point, because you're talking about this intergenerational Ponzi scheme. That's really what Social Security is. I mean, it wasn't created that way in the 1930s when Roosevelt first concocted this Social Security, and it was totally unconstitutional, and it's unfortunate that we have it. But the idea was that it was like insurance. The government was going to take the money and invest it, and then when everybody was older, you would get paid your benefits. And they even called the taxes premiums. But the whole thing was a con, because it never was insurance, because the government never invested the money. They spent the money. And now they gave themselves an IOU. They created these things called trust funds. And so what would happen is the government would collect the money from Social Security. Then they would take the Social Security money and spend it on whatever, military or whatever they were doing. But then they would put an IOU in the government trust fund in the form of a bond. And then they would say, oh, we have an asset in this trust fund. We have a bond. That's not an asset. It's your own debt. It's like if I write myself a check for $1 million, I can't take that uncashed check and claim I've got $1 million asset. No, I mean, it's also $1 million liability. So there never was any money in Social Security. They spent it all. The system is broke. And now they have to keep raising taxes on the workers, but now they won't even raise taxes on the workers. So they create inflation to pay for Social Security. Is the accumulation of every year's budget deficit, and then you've got the annual budget deficit, which adds to the total debt. But when I'm talking about creditors versus debtors, nations can either be a creditor nation or a debtor nation. A creditor nation is a nation in which the world owes it money, more money than it owes the world. A debtor nation owes the world more than it's owed. So prior to the US going off the gold standard in 1971, and in fact, all the way up to probably the early 1980s, the United States was the world's biggest creditor nation. Right? We generated tremendous amounts of wealth under a freer economy than the one we have today, and one that was governed by the disciplines of a gold standard. So we became the world's wealthiest creditor nation. Today, after 50 years of fiat money, America is not only the world's biggest debtor nation, America owes more money than all the other debtor nations of the world combined. Right? That's how much our financial position has eroded. Now, when the dollar became the reserve currency, it became the reserve currency because of America's financial and industrial might. We were the world's biggest creditor nation. We also had huge trade surpluses. Now we have massive trade deficits. I mean, over $1 trillion a year. But when the dollar became the reserve currency, we made everything. You know, all the consumer electronics that are now made in Japan or Korea or China, all that stuff was made in America. I mean, if you wanted anything, we made it in this country, in America. And so since everybody wanted American products, everybody needed American dollars to buy them. And the American dollar was as good as gold, because if you had dollars, you had gold. If you had $35, you could get an ounce of gold from the government. It was convertible. And so under those conditions, the US dollar became the reserve currency. But today, the dollar would never be the reserve currency today if it wasn't already there, right? Nobody would pick the dollar given our financial position, our trade imbalances. But, you know, it's been the reserve currency because, you know, for the tradition of the fact that it's been. But in order for the world to maintain this status, it's very expensive for the world. It's a huge benefit for America. I said we have $1 trillion a year trade deficit. That means the world has to supply America with $1 million worth of merchandise for which it doesn't get paid, right? It doesn't get products. You know, most countries, in order to export, in order to import, have to export. You have to export something in order to pay for your imports. Well, we don't have to export anything. We just print money and export that. Well, that costs nothing. But the rest of the world has to produce real stuff and use resources, land, labor, and capital to produce products. So Americans get to live beyond their means because of the dollar status. But the rest of the world collectively lives beneath its means. And of course, it's not consistent because some countries have to live even further below their means, depending on how big a trade surplus they have with the United States. That's how much they're subsidizing the U.S. economy. So a lot of the emerging markets bear an even bigger burden of preserving the dollar status. And so I think the world is starting to move away from the dollar, not only because of the economic cost of maintaining it, but now we have raised the political risks. If you look at what the Biden administration did with Russia, the unprecedented sanctions on Russia, this has really highlighted the tremendous risk that every sovereign nation assumes by being beholden to the dollar, because it puts tremendous power in the hands of the United States. It's like putting a noose around your neck and then throwing it over a tree to America, who's holding the other end, and you're hoping that they don't pull. I mean, nobody wants to really be in that position, especially if you're a country like China, where, you know, we've kind of made China our enemy. But in reality, China provides America with the largest annual subsidy. They're our biggest trade deficit is with China. So they supply us with more merchandise than anybody else. And they're our largest creditor. Now, some people say it's Japan, but no, it's actually China, because you have to take Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is part of China. So if you take all the treasuries that Hong Kong owns and the treasuries that China owns, that's more than Japan. So they're our biggest banker. They supply us with credit. They supply us with merchandise, right? That's all going to end, right? China